The road leading toward the Whittaker family home in Odd, West Virginia, had once been a stretch of earth that rarely saw a dust trail behind car. Locals knew it well enough, but outsiders never traveled it. There were no tour buses, no influencers holding up phones, no curious wanderers staring out their windows at the houses tucked deep in the hills. The Whittakers lived in a place that hardly anyone beyond Raleigh County could point to on a map. Their world moved at its own rhythm, untouched by cameras, headlines, or online commentary. For years, the family existed in that quiet. Whatever hardships they carried privately. Whatever people in town whispered, it stayed local. But the borders of that privacy shifted the day a car came up the dirt road, carrying a man with a camera. The footage from that visit traveled farther than anyone in Odd could have imagined. Within days of being uploaded, the Whittaker family became a global spectacle. The images, the reactions, the fascination, it all grew beyond anything they had encountered before. To the internet, it was a viral sensation. To media outlets, it was an unusual and provocative headline. To filmmaker Mark Laita, it was another installment of soft white underbelly. But to Larry Whittaker, it was the moment the quiet life he'd known began collapsing under the weight of strangers' attention. Larry does not speak in polished statements. He doesn't frame things like a public figure or a strategist. His words come from a man who watched the world reinvent his family's identity without asking what they wanted. When he looks back at the chain of events, the videos, the reactions, the tourists, the donations, the escalating chaos, his feelings settle into one blunt conclusion he has repeated more than once. This is Mark's fault. In this part of the documentary, the focus turns to Larry's perception, the foundation of his blame, and the emotional architecture behind the 7 grievances he believes were set in motion the instant the lens pointed toward his family. The story is constructed from publicly documented reactions, news reports, community commentary, and a long trail of online discourse that followed those first viral videos. It is an attempt to examine his perspective as faithfully as possible, not to assign definitive truth, but to understand the experience of a man who feels his world was altered by someone he once regarded simply as a visitor with a camera. The Whittaker family story has often been told by outsiders, social media personalities, reporters, commentators, and viewers who clicked and commented without ever coming close to the front porch in Odd. It has been repeated, reshaped, exaggerated, debated, and dissected. But the perspective of the family members themselves, especially Larry, has frequently been overshadowed by the spectacle. This documentary aims to center his voice and examine why he holds Mark responsible for the chain of events that followed. The first part of Larry's anger comes from a deep sense of economic exploitation. From his vantage point, the videos generated millions of views. People talked about monetized content, Patreon supporters, book deals, and a thriving YouTube platform. The channel that showcased the Whittakers was large, influential, and profitable. Larry's family, meanwhile, still lived in the same conditions reported on for years: trailer structures in disrepair, inconsistent sanitation, and an environment repeatedly described by journalists as harsh and severely neglected. Larry has often emphasized the disconnect he perceives between the success of the content about his family and the lack of visible long-term improvement in their home. He hears about donations, fundraising drives, and enormous public attention. Yet in his daily life, he continues facing the same difficulties he faced before the world heard the name Whittaker. To him, this feels like a fundamental imbalance, a system in which the people capturing the story walked away more secure than the people who lived it. Whether that impression aligns with every financial detail behind the scenes is impossible for him to measure, but blame is built on what he can see, not on what might exist in spreadsheets. The second part of Larry's resentment emerges from the sudden influx of strangers who arrived after the videos spread. Reports from locals and neighbors describe people driving down the family's road simply to look at them, film them, or take pictures of their home. The term inbred family circulated widely online, and that harmful label became the reason many people traveled to see the Whittakers, as if they were an attraction rather than a private family. Larry remembers the shift vividly. The transition from being ignored by the world to being treated like an exhibit. He recalls vehicles stopping in front of the home, cameras pointed at windows, people peering out from rolled-down windows with the same curiosity someone might have for a roadside oddity. This surge of uninvited visitors made the family feel trapped in a space that had once been safe. Their porch, which used to be a place of rest, became a stage. Their yard became a backdrop for stranger stories. From Larry's perspective, none of this happened before the videos were published. None of it happened until the footage reached millions of people, most of whom would never speak to him directly or consider the emotional cost of their curiosity. To Larry, that change was not caused by the abstract force of the internet. It had a starting point, the moment a filmmaker's footage went public. A third point of tension for Larry stems from the transformation of his family's struggles into entertainment. Media analysts, commenters, and even some journalists described the viral reaction to the videos as a troubling example of voyeurism. The comment sections under related content were filled with jokes, shock, and gawking curiosity. YouTubers created reaction videos. Influencers dissected the family's genetics and behavior without any medical or ethical basis. Users amplified the most sensational angles for views and likes. For Larry, this shift was not a conversation about representation. It was a moment where millions of people seemed to consume his family's pain as if it were a piece of unusual content, something to share and joke about. He has expressed frustration that the emotional and material challenges they lived with daily became subject matter for entertainment algorithms. Even well-intentioned viewers disappeared into the larger noise. He rarely remembers the compassionate comments first. He remembers the ridicule. This third wound is less about the filmmaker's intentions and more about the outcome. In Larry's experience, the videos opened a door that invited the worst parts of internet culture into their life. The jokes, the judgment, the shock value, all of it entered because the footage existed in the first place. A fourth grievance revolves around expectations that grew around the fundraising campaigns tied to the family. After the videos went viral, tens of thousands of dollars were raised to support the Whittakers. Public posts discussed improving their housing, addressing safety issues, and ensuring long-term stability. The narrative around the fundraising often implied that transformative change was coming. Yet repeated reporting described the family's home and environment in nearly the same terms years later. Larry saw donations come in, watched public excitement build, and listened to promises about change. But his day-to-day reality remained largely the same. From where he stands, it created a sense of being used as a symbolic cause rather than being equipped with practical, sustainable help. The distance between the size of the donations and the quality of life he still experiences fuels a deep sense of betrayal. For Larry, this issue extends beyond money. It touches trust, dignity, and the belief that outsiders profited from the visibility of his family without delivering the improvement he expected. The fifth and most painful source of blame, according to Larry, is the involvement of state authorities. In late 2024, 3 family members, Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, were removed from the home by West Virginia officials. News coverage framed the decision in terms of health and safety concerns. But for Larry, the timeline is undeniable in his mind. He believes the years of public scrutiny contributed to outside pressure and motivated authorities who, for decades, left the family alone. He has said that the disruption began as soon as the cameras turned toward them, and he connects the removal of his relatives directly to the exposure created by the viral videos. Whether officials acted independently or responded to community concern is something the public cannot fully parse. But emotionally, for Larry, the presence of the camera and the arrival of authorities are fused. His loved ones were taken after the world discovered them, not before. That correlation has shaped a deep, lasting anger. Another issue that deepened his resentment was what he perceived as hypocrisy. After the family's privacy was lost and tourists began driving up to the home, the filmmaker eventually warned viewers not to visit the Whittakers and emphasized that the community did not welcome intrusions. To some viewers, those warnings sounded responsible. To Larry, they sounded hollow. He sees them as an attempt to control a situation that began with the act of filming, an act that opened the gates to the attention he now despises. From his perspective, warnings came after the money was earned and after the audience already knew where to look. Finally, the emotional undercurrent of all these grievances is resentment, a long-term, heavy resentment that sits beneath every other frustration he carries. It is a resentment shaped by feeling exposed, used, and misunderstood. It grows from seeing his family's life turned into a global discussion without their control. It deepens when he remembers the insults, the judgments, and the endless commentary from people who do not know him. It hardens when he looks at a home forever changed by attention he never asked for. In Larry's words, everything began the moment that camera arrived. His perspective is that his family became a story for millions, yet they were left to manage the consequences largely alone. The filmmaker became a public figure with influence and profit. Larry became a character in a narrative shaped by others. This documentary begins not by deciding who is right, but by acknowledging that both sides of this story carry weight. On one side are the possible regrets, unintended consequences, and difficult ethical questions surrounding documentary work with vulnerable individuals. On the other side are the experiences of a family who believes their lives were destabilized by exposure they did not choose. Between these two perspectives lies a complicated reality that cannot be resolved with a single explanation. The Whittakers remain human beings living through the aftermath of decisions made far outside their control. Their story continues, shaped not just by filmmakers or viewers, but by the choices that communities, supporters, critics, and platforms make today. This investigation begins with Larry's voice because his understanding of what happened forms the emotional core of the conflict. His story is not the only story, but it is one that demands to be heard. Comment below if you have documented information, credible reports, or firsthand knowledge that adds context or challenges any part of this narrative. Share it respectfully. Comment with sources, experiences, or insights that can be checked and incorporated. This story evolves with evidence, accountability, and the voices of those who see what others overlook. As the world's attention settled on the Whittaker family, a widening gap began to form between how outsiders interpreted the situation and how Larry experienced it from inside the home. This part of the story explores the fractures that grew in that space, the misunderstandings, the assumptions, and the emotional tensions that shaped Larry's belief that Mark had brought chaos, not help, to their doorstep. For many viewers, the videos were a window into a hidden corner of America. For Larry, they were the beginning of a new and confusing chapter he never asked to live through. Once the first video circulated, the viral momentum took on a life of its own. Internet forums erupted with speculation about the family's history. Reaction channels extracted clips, freezing frames for shock value, and dissecting the behavior of individual family members like analyzing a puzzle instead of human lives. Larry noticed the way people spoke about them, using phrases he had never heard before, labels that reduced complex lives into digestible talking points. The Whittakers were being discussed by strangers who knew nothing of their past beyond the fragments displayed online. They simplified, exaggerated, and filled in gaps with their own assumptions. Over time, the public developed a narrative about the family that was incomplete, sometimes inaccurate, and often cruel. Larry watched this unfold from inside a house that struggled to stay upright, scrolling through comments when he had the chance, listening to neighbors describe what they saw online. That growing disconnect between the family's lived reality and the world's imagination became one of the deepest wounds. One of the first signs of this shift came in how people tried to explain the family. Online spaces filled with amateur genealogists and self-proclaimed medical experts who invented theories about the family's origins, disabilities, and relationships. Larry heard versions of his family's story that bore little resemblance to the truth he knew. People argued over details without realizing what they were discussing were human lives. Their tone was often one of fascination rather than respect. That fascination stung, because for Larry the circumstances others treated like an oddity were the fabric of his daily life. This dynamic is common in viral content involving vulnerable people. But in this case, the consequences were immediate and tangible. The videos did not simply spark conversation. They altered the flow of life around the Whittakers. Locals noticed more cars driving through odd. Some pulled over. Some filmed without permission. Others attempted to speak with family members directly, not understanding or not caring. How intrusive it felt. Reporters described the road as increasingly busy, a phenomenon it had never experienced before. The sudden presence of outsiders made Larry hyper-aware of his surroundings. He became more protective, more wary of faces he didn't recognize. What had once been a private environment became a stage with an involuntary audience. The pressure of being watched weighed on him. Even the most mundane activities, a walk outside, a moment of rest on the porch, a conversation among relatives, could now be captured by someone passing through. The loss of privacy was not abstract. It was constant. Meanwhile, online communities debated whether the family had benefited from the exposure. People posted screenshots of donation totals. They speculated about how funds were being managed, where the money went, and whether the family had actually received what was promised. Without clear public documentation, theories competed with one another. Some believed the family gained more support than ever before. Others believed the opposite. Larry observed these discussions and felt increasingly invisible within them. They talked about him, but not to him. They analyzed the family's finances without understanding his experience of scarcity. To Larry, the problem was simple. If the exposure brought resources, he did not see the transformation those resources should have created. His home still suffered from structural issues. Electrical problems persisted. Plumbing remained unreliable. He saw no new house, no long-term stability, no relief from the daily challenges that had defined much of his life. The public, he felt, had been given an impression of progress that did not align with what he lived. That mismatch grew into resentment toward the person who initiated the entire chain of events, the man with the camera. Another aspect of the widening gap came from the expectations placed on the family once they became public figures. Before the videos, no one expected the Whittakers to perform or explain themselves. They lived quietly, rarely encountering strangers who wanted to film them, study them, or turn them into symbolic figures in debates about poverty, disability, and rural America. After the videos, they were suddenly the subject of moral arguments on social media. People questioned whether the family should have agreed to appear on camera. Others argued they had no ability to consent. Some accused the filmmaker of exploitation. Others defended him. Through all these debates, Larry felt the world discussing issues that were deeply personal to him without ever acknowledging his perspective directly. This isolation intensified as the situation grew more complicated. Over time, family members began to express different feelings about their portrayal. Some accepted the presence of cameras. Some resisted. Some seemed indifferent. The lack of a unified response made outsiders even more confident in projecting their own interpretations onto the family. Larry's voice was one of the strongest, but public discourse often favored narratives that fit the viral image already constructed. Larry wasn't just fighting against the filmmaker. He was fighting against an entire online ecosystem that had decided what the Whittakers represented. This struggle made him feel increasingly misunderstood. To him, the story had been told without the necessary context, without acknowledging generational hardship, systemic poverty, social isolation, and the complexity of disability. These factors, which shaped his family's life long before the camera arrived, were overshadowed by the shock value that fueled the viral reaction. He believed the omissions made the family appear more vulnerable, more unusual, more story-worthy to outsiders. This reinforced his belief that the filmmaker had portrayed them without enough care or depth. As time went on, the expectations placed on Mark also shifted. Viewers wanted updates, more footage, more insight into the family struggles. With each new video, the audience grew, and with growth came demand. The family became serialized content. Larry noticed how viewers started speaking about the Whittakers the way fans speak about characters on a show. They debated personalities. They requested follow-up episodes. They speculated about conflicts. That normalization of the family as entertainment further fueled his anger. A major turning point came when Larry realized how differently the world perceived Mark compared to how he perceived him. To many viewers, Mark was seen as compassionate, empathetic, and committed to documenting the unseen struggles of America. Some praised his work as eye-opening. Others defended him fiercely when critics raised concerns. But Larry's experiences with Mark were shaped not by online interpretations, but by what he witnessed on the ground. The disruption to his home, the influx of strangers, the altered rhythms of daily life, and the emotional burden his family carried after becoming a global subject. This divergence created a frustrating paradox. The very person Larry blamed was being celebrated by thousands of strangers. The audience saw Mark as a storyteller bringing light to hidden suffering. Larry saw him as someone who took their suffering and amplified it without protecting them from the consequences. When he heard people describe the videos as powerful, impactful, or inspiring, it clashed with the turmoil he felt inside the home. Another piece of the widening gap involved how the public interpreted the state's decision to remove family members. Online discussions speculated endlessly about whether the intervention was overdue, whether it was appropriate, or whether it was influenced by the viral attention. Larry saw all this conversation and felt the distance between public opinion and personal impact stretch even wider. From his perspective, the removal of Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy was not a policy issue, a public health debate, or a discussion topic. It was a personal loss. It was the fracture of a home. As the public framed the event in terms of morality or state responsibility, Larry framed it in terms of responsibility and causation. For him, the timeline mattered. The authorities came after the world discovered the Whittakers, not before. That alone made the explanation clear in his mind. He did not care about legal nuances or political debate. He cared about the fact that his family was no longer together. This separation between the personal and the public, between experience and interpretation, grew into one of the largest emotional divides in the entire story. Larry felt unheard. He felt misrepresented. He felt like the world believed it knew him when, in his view, it understood almost nothing. As the years passed, the viral fascination faded somewhat, but the consequences remained. Traffic on the road slowed, but did not disappear. The assumptions made by outsiders persisted. The family members who had been removed did not return to the home. Donations fluctuated. Promises of improvement remained ambiguous. And Larry's resentment hardened into something more permanent. An enduring belief that his family's suffering had been magnified, not alleviated by exposure. This part of the documentary seeks to illustrate that emotional landscape. Larry's blame does not exist in a vacuum. It developed through years of watching strangers shape a narrative around his family, years of feeling the effects of public attention without the benefits people assumed he received, and years of living with outcomes that to him traced directly back to one decision: to publish the footage. It is in this widening gap between intent and impact, between public narrative and personal experience, that the conflict deepens. And for Larry, it becomes increasingly clear that what began as a moment of curiosity for the world became a long-term burden his family is still carrying. Comment below. Share verifiable reporting, first-hand experiences, or credible sources that expand on the public reaction, the aftermath, or the family's perspective. Responsible editions help refine and strengthen the historical record of this story. As the months turned into years after the first video's release, the strain within the Whittaker household grew into something heavier, more persistent, and harder for Larry to ignore. What began as discomfort evolved into a breaking point, an emotional threshold shaped by exhaustion, distrust, and the gradual realization that the world's eyes were not moving away. This part examines the slow build toward that breaking point and how each piece of the situation contributed to the frustration Larry carries today. The first sign that the attention was not fading came through the constant reminders that the family remained a subject of fascination. Even after the initial viral explosion quieted, new waves of viewers discovered the videos, reposted them, or used clips out of context. Every time a video resurfaced, every time a reaction channel revived interest, Larry felt the cycle restart. Comments appeared on social platforms debating the family again. Articles resurfaced with headlines that framed the Whittakers as symbols rather than individuals. Even people who considered themselves supportive often described the family in reductive ways that reinforced stereotypes rather than challenged them. This ongoing cycle created a sense of being trapped in a story with no ending. Larry was aware that viral fame often fades quickly for most people, but in his case, it did not disappear. It returned in waves, each one carrying fresh commentary from strangers who believed they understood the Whittaker family's life from a few minutes of footage. The permanence of that exposure weighed on him. His anger intensified because the situation felt inescapable. Even if he wanted to reclaim privacy, reclaim normalcy, or rebuild a shield around his family, the videos remained online, continuing to draw attention long after the camera left the property. Another factor pushing him toward the breaking point was the difficulty of trusting anyone who approached the family afterward. In the years before the videos, interactions with the outside world were few, but they were predictable. Afterward, every new person the family encountered raised questions. Was this visitor someone genuinely trying to help? Someone hoping to film? Someone seeking a personal thrill? Someone who only knew the Whittakers through the viral lens? This uncertainty made Larry more protective. He guarded conversations, was suspicious of unfamiliar faces, and hesitated to engage with people who claimed to be supporters. The idea of help itself became complicated because so many promises had been made publicly. Promises of improved living conditions, new housing, long-term support. When those promises did not manifest in the way he expected, every new attempt from outsiders to assist was met with skepticism. His patience for explanations diminished. His anger was not directed only at the filmmaker, but at the entire mechanism of attention and interference that followed. And then came the moment that fractured everything: the intervention by state authorities. The removal of Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy marked a turning shift in the family's story and solidified Larry's belief that exposure had brought harm into their lives. To many observers, the intervention was framed around safety concerns, but for Larry, it represented an irreversible rupture in the family unit. He connected the arrival of officials directly to the heightened scrutiny caused by the viral videos, the media coverage, and the public's ongoing commentary about the conditions inside the home. This was the point at which Larry's resentment hardened into something more immovable. He had watched people laugh at his family. He had watched strangers invade their privacy. But losing family members to state custody was the moment he felt the consequences became unbearable. He described the change as happening immediately after the camera arrived. Whether others agree with his interpretation does not alter the weight of that belief in his mind. That belief shapes everything he says now, everything he feels about the situation, and every accusation he directs toward Mark. Another part of the breaking point stems from Larry's perception of hypocrisy in the warnings given by the filmmaker to viewers. Once it became clear that strangers were traveling to Odd, West Virginia, the filmmaker began urging visitors to stay away and respect the family's privacy. Many viewers interpreted this as a responsible act. But for Larry, those warnings sounded like an afterthought, one that came only after the damage had already occurred. He viewed them as an attempt to manage a situation that had grown beyond control, without acknowledging that the exposure itself had created the demand for those visits. This perceived contradiction, sharing the family with millions and then telling millions not to approach, left Larry with a bitter sense of distrust. He questioned the sincerity of the warnings and wondered why protection had not been prioritized before the videos were published. In his view, the sequence mattered. The invitation came first, the caution came later. That sequence shaped the emotional logic behind his anger. As Larry approached his breaking point, the emotional toll became visible in his demeanor, his statements, and the way he recounts the events. He speaks with a mix of frustration and exhaustion, as if the weight of the past years rests on his shoulders alone. He often returns to a single idea, that the family was living quietly before the footage, and everything that followed was a direct consequence of that moment. Whether this simplifies the larger socioeconomic and systemic issues that shape the family's life is a question for broader analysis. But for Larry, the connection is clear and personal. His breaking point was not one explosive incident, but a culmination of smaller moments. The stares from strangers, the jokes online, the expectations created by fundraising, the pressure of surveillance, and the devastating intervention by authorities. Each added a new layer to his resentment. Each confirmed, in his eyes, that the decision to record the family had been catastrophic. What makes this breaking point so significant in the documentary narrative is not just the anger itself, but the insight it offers into how people in vulnerable situations often experience exposure. The filmmaker may not have predicted the reaction. Viewers may not have intended harm, but intention and impact are rarely aligned in viral stories. Larry's breaking point illustrates how quickly a well-intentioned documentary can evolve into a complicated and painful reality for the subjects involved. This section does not draw conclusions about who is right or wrong. Instead, it marks the emotional apex of Larry's perspective, the place where disappointment becomes resentment, where confusion becomes conviction, and where the idea of blame transitions from an opinion into a personal truth. It is the turning point in the story where his anger becomes the defining force behind his understanding of what happened to the Whittaker family. Comment below. Provide verifiable sources, first-hand accounts, or documented evidence that shed light on the family's experiences during the period of mounting public attention. Such contributions help ensure that this ongoing story is recorded with accuracy and respect. For many viewers, the Whittakers remained an unforgettable part of internet culture, an example of raw documentary work, of poverty displayed unfiltered, of a family introduced to the world without preparation. But for Larry, the attention did not fade the way it did for the audience. Even as viral trends moved on, the effects remained embedded in his environment. The occasional cars still passing, the lingering judgments from outsiders, the pressure on local authorities, the strain inside the home. These were not abstract ripples, but daily reminders of how far the footage had traveled. Larry's resentment hardened into something both simple and immovable. He came to believe that once the videos reached millions, the course of his family's future shifted permanently. He wasn't thinking in terms of ethics, filmmaking guidelines, or debates about consent. He was thinking about the concrete facts he woke up to: missing family members, broken trust, a home that didn't improve the way viewers believed it would, and a name that carried associations he never created. Those who defended the filmmaker often argued that he brought the family help, donations, attention, resources. But Larry measured help not in numbers, but in outcomes. And when he looked at the outcomes, he saw a story out of his control, a narrative built around him without his consent, and a wave of consequences that left the family more exposed than supported. Whether or not the filmmaker intended harm was irrelevant to Larry. What mattered was what happened. This is the crux of the divide. Two sides of a story shaped by entirely different vantage points. On one side is a documentary creator who believed he was revealing a hidden reality. On the other side is a man who feels his private struggles were turned into public entertainment, sparking a chain of events that altered his family's life in ways they could not undo. And so Larry returns again and again to the same conclusion. If the camera had never come up that road, none of this would have happened. His words, sharp, frustrated, unwavering, summarize years of pain in one sentence he has repeated more than once. It all happened as soon as he took his dumb self up there. For viewers, this story raises questions that linger long after the video ends. What responsibilities do filmmakers owe to vulnerable families? What protections should exist for people who become viral without understanding the consequences? When help is promised, what counts as fulfillment? And who gets to decide when a story is worth telling? The Whittakers are no longer just subjects in a documentary. They're a family still navigating the fallout of unexpected fame. The choices people make now, whether to respect their boundaries, support them responsibly, or exploit their image further, shape what happens next. Comment below. Share what you know. Add verified information, first-hand experiences, or credible sources that can deepen or clarify the story. Do you believe Larry is right to place blame? Do you think the filmmaker lost control of the narrative? Or does the truth live somewhere between them? Your insight matters. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.